I Lost My Body follows the dual misadventures of a severed hand that just escaped from a dissection facility, and now Phil, a young man who's trying to win the heart of Gabrielle after a chance encounter. It is currently on Netflix for you to watch, and I think you should, as it is one of the films nominated for the Best Animated Feature category for the 2020 Oscars. The film was directed by Jérémy Clapin, and before this he had only really directed 3 short films. This is in fact his feature debut, and oh, what a debut it is. But before we get into this discussion/review, hello! Hello viewers, my name is TJ and welcome to Cinemateq. On this channel we like doing a lot of things that have to do with cinema, with film, and in this particular video we are going to be discussing the film I Lost My Body. I checked this film out a few days ago. I think it's really worth talking about, as it's not your typical animated film, at least if you are only going for films that are in the Disney canon. For those coming here for more of a review, I will say that there will be a lot of spoilers all throughout this video. I'm going to be discussing the film fairly freely because I want us to be able to have discussions about the film, and I think being really vague doesn't really help with having a good discussion about a movie. So this is your spoiler warning. Now with that said, where I really want to start with this film is why I think it's different from your typical Disney fare. And from the introduction, I'm sure you can already guess the main reason. The fact that this film follows a severed hand. So right off the bat, it needs to be said that this is a film for grown-ups. I don't want to tell you how to parent your kids, but if your kids are really into this idea and they really want to watch this film, I would say maybe check out the movie for yourself before you let them watch it. There is swearing, there is nudity, there are definite adult themes, there's a little bit of blood, as you can imagine, because we're talking about following around a severed hand. And as I mentioned, it is nominated for the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature Film alongside films such as Missing Link and Toy Story 4. Those films are obviously made for children. This one is not, and I can understand that some people might get confused by that, thinking that animated features are only made for children, and let me tell you, that is absolutely not the case. So if it's not a Disney film and it's not really family friendly, then what exactly is I Lost My Body? And the best way I can think about describing it right from the get-go is it reminded me of a Satoshi Kon film, talking about films like Perfect Blue and Paprika, in that the film really leans into surrealist imagery while tackling themes and presenting them in a specifically adult way. Now, as a caveat to that, I will say that I Lost My Body is less concerned with identity as a construct as it is with the emotional journey of a character and how we need to process and get past trauma in our lives in order to live a more fulfilling life, and I'm going to get more into that later. But I did want to highlight those specific differences between Satoshi Kon's work and I Lost My Body. But I think if you're a fan of Satoshi Kon's work, you will find a lot to like in this film. Next, I want to talk about how the film presents itself. And the film has 3 particular ways that it presents the narrative, and specifically the way that the characters interact with it. The first is through black and white flashbacks. These are very obvious, they're all black and white. As soon as you see them, you understand them to be memories. But then we have the dual plot lines of the severed hand and Now Phil. And at first, we just assume that they are happening parallel to each other because they are both in color. We are contrasting them directly with the black and white images. So the black and white images are the past and the color images are the present. And there isn't really much inside of the film to distinguish between those 2 parallel plot lines, except for the fact that we go between essentially 2 different characters, Now Phil and the severed hand, and we just assume that they're in the same city and that perhaps we are leading to a kind of meeting at some point at the end of the film. But this, as it turns out, is not exactly the case. When we get to the end of the film, we learn that Now Phil's arc is actually the recent past and the severed hand is the present. Both of those parallel plot lines, or at least what I thought were parallel plot lines, were actually happening one after the other. Now this is where we get into a bit of spoiler territory. If you don't want to know how this film ends, you should probably just stop watching this video right this second. But we end up watching Now Phil making the mistake that leads to his hand getting severed off from his arm. And it is Naofil's own severed hand that escapes the dissection lab and makes its way through the city trying to get to him. Now, upon first watch, I thought that the director was trying to go for some kind of aha moment here, where we realize that the two storylines are not happening parallel to each other, but actually one after the other. And at first I felt kind of cheated by the film because it didn't have any particular kind of effect on me. The realization that the storylines were not parallel didn't get me. It wasn't like an epiphany going off in my mind. But then as I started to think about the film after that, and as I started to compare those two storylines a bit more closely, I started to realize that there actually were some distinguishing factors between them that separated them, much in the same way that the black and white images separated the past from the present/near past. Essentially, when we're watching Naofil, when he has both of his hands, we are seeing his day-to-day life in a very realist sense. There is nothing surrealist going on in these images. We are watching a depressed young man, someone in his late teens, early 20s, who's a bad pizza delivery driver, who doesn't really know what they're doing with their life and is not fulfilling any of their potential. We are seeing them in a depressed state, and then finding someone that they at least want to talk to and perhaps build a relationship with, and then the journey that Naofil goes on in order to try and build that relationship with Gabrielle. And in the instance of the severed hand, we get much, much more surrealist imagery. A lot of things that are actually referenced in the flashbacks turn up in the surrealist imagery that permeates throughout the severed hand's narrative. One of those things is the fact that when Naofil is like 5 or 6 years old, he tells his father that he wants to be a pianist and an astronaut. And in one pivotal scene for the severed hand, we see an astronaut in a place where you would not expect to see an astronaut. Thinking back on it, these things were all very obvious, or at least they should have been to me on first viewing. And one of the reasons why I think they weren't is that the director didn't spotlight these surrealist images inside of the severed hand plotline. They were just sort of there. They were focused on from time to time, but it never felt like the director was presenting them in a way that was forcing you to notice them. He wasn't shoving them in your face. He was making them part of the scenery and certainly focusing on them in a couple of instances, but it would be easy to just get wrapped up in the fact that you're watching a severed hand, accept it as surrealist anyways, and not necessarily come to differentiate that plot from Naofil's in any kind of particular temporal way. But when I start going back and thinking about it, the fact that Naofil's plotline was so straightforward from an imagery standpoint, and that the Severed Hands one was so littered with surrealist elements, that was the differentiating factor. I still think that when we get to the point of convergence, when we understand the temporal relation between the storylines, there still is no aha moment, but now I realize that there really wasn't supposed to be one, and that if I was paying attention, that would have been telegraphed to me well in advance. Now I want to dive into the narrative just a little bit more. In I Lost My Body, it starts with a trope, a kind of classic trope, the boy stalks girl, girl falls in love with boy stalker trope. It does that. A lot of Naofil's storyline revolves around his pursuit of Gabrielle and his somewhat sleazy manner of going about it. You might think that it's kind of a sweet thing that he's doing, but it's stalking. It's absolutely stalking, without a doubt. And I was really worried, especially with the way that the film was building up their relationship, that when we get to the moment when Naofil reveals himself to Gabrielle, that he is someone from her past and that he had been doing all of these things specifically to get close to her, I was really worried that Gabrielle was going to be like, "Oh, that's cool. I'm so glad that you did all this, and it means so much to me that you tried so hard," and I was going to face palm and be kind of angry with this film. But when we get to that moment, Gabrielle rejects him, and more so, she admonishes him. She calls him selfish. She wonders if he had any real idea what he was doing and how what he was doing might affect both her and the people around her. And I was so relieved when we got to this part of the film. The fact that the boy stalker was shown to be a boy stalker, and that it's much better to just be honest and upfront with people, and trying to spy on them and manipulate them and insert yourself into someone's life like that, you shouldn't do it. I applaud this film for taking that trope and kind of turning it on its head a little bit shows it how destructive it can be if we don't call it out for what it is, which is, just creepy bullshit. And to go on that a little bit more, I would love to see this more in films as we move on, where we can identify problematic tropes and then say, okay, but how can we use that trope, set up this trope, and then knock it down by the end of the film? And I'd actually love to know from you guys in the comments below, are there any tropes in particular that you would like to see sort of knocked down a peg or torn down completely? Let me know in the comments. Before I go, I do want to end talking about the narrative once again and what I think the film was essentially doing. As I mentioned before, we had the stuff that was happening in the past that was in black and white, and we had the narrative elements of the severed hand kind of walking around, and now Phil living his life up to the point where he severs his hand. But then the film also goes beyond that. We have that point of convergence where the severed hand catches up to now Phil after he's been super depressed after losing said hand, but they never actually end up meeting together. And now Phil is depressed, he's trying to figure out what to do with his life, and he goes back to something that was kind of a comfort for him, and through it he's able to figure out how to move forward with his life. And we do get a kind of ambiguous ending where Gabrielle finds this thing. It's a tape recorder that now Phil used to record things when he was a kid. And the overall impression I got is that where we end with now Phil is that he got back that kind of zest for life that he had when he was a child. And this is important. And I probably should have mentioned this. I probably should have done a whole better overview of the narrative, but let me just throw out the pertinent details to you right now. When now Phil was young, his parents were killed in a car crash, which you could argue he was partially responsible for. And after that, he had to go live with his uncle and cousin in Paris. And it's at that moment when the kid who wanted to be a pianist and an astronaut and just wanted to live his best life shrunk down and became a kind of shell of himself, and continued being that shell up until the point where he meets Gabrielle, where he starts getting part of his life back, and then, he accidentally cuts off his hand, giving him to his lowest point of his life. At least that's how the film presents it in my eyes. Then, as now Phil is listening to the tapes that he made as a kid, he gets back this kind of zest for life that he had. The kid who wanted to be an astronaut, who wanted to be a pianist, that kid came out again because now Phil decided to take a risk, a leap, you could say. Not a leap of faith, it's not exactly that, but still a leap. And the fact that he goes through with it, that he does it, says to me that he's gotten back what he initially lost when his parents were killed. And I think that's meant to be the thematic through line of the entire film, that when tragedy strikes us at a young age, or really any age at all, it can take something from us. It can remove part of it. And as we go through life, if we don't actively try to get it back, or at least try to think of what we were like before that tragedy happened, we could lose that part of ourselves forever. And when now Phil realizes that, when he understands that he needs to take back that part of his life and to take that leap, he actually moves on to a place that is much better than where he was at the start of the film. And that is without his hand. And I think that's actually a very powerful message that the film portrays, that even if tragedy strikes, and in now Phil's case it strikes twice, when you take agency, when you take control of it, you can live the life that you always wanted to, despite the tragedy that happened to you. For that reason, I think the film is very powerful. But I also understand that this is an open-ended film. There's a lot that could be dissected from it, and so I want to throw it back to you, quoting Philip DeFranco, I guess, with that little thing. Please let me know what you thought about the film in the comments below, and what you thought the main through line of the film was. And with that said, we are now at the end of the video. Please let me know what you thought about this little discussion video that I've done. I want to do a lot more of these. And if you've seen I Lost My Body, please let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. If this discussion makes you want to go see it, all the better. I would love to hear from you. And if it does make you want to go see it, then please just give me a like. I would really appreciate it. We have a lot of other stuff coming out on the channel. Tomorrow, there will be a review of Les Miserables, the new French film that is nominated for Best International Film at the Oscars. And then on Friday, I will have a discussion video for Uncut Gems coming for you as well. And then after that, it's going to be a live stream on Sunday, as there always is. So please, if you want to see all of this stuff, make sure to subscribe to the channel, get notified by clicking on that bell, and that's about it. Thank you so much for hanging out for me, and I'll see you in the next video.